You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. We have now officially made it to the last chapter of Ecclesiastes. We have gotten to the end. Give yourself a little pat on the back and a little round of applause for making it this far with us. Really, I appreciate that. This is the longest study that we have done so far as a podcast, and it's been an intense book to study, but it has been so rich with meaning and practical application for our lives today. As we get into this chapter, Chapter 12 is very much a litmus test for commentaries, sermons, books, whatever you have that talks about Ecclesiastes, because if it talks about Ecclesiastes at all, which is pretty rare in the first place, is probably going to talk about this chapter. If you hear a sermon on Ecclesiastes, it will probably be this chapter, if not chapter 3 with the whole Times poem. But this is a place that many preachers and commentators will turn to in order to take away the sting of the book, because many readers see this chapter as diluting or watering down the punch of the rest of the book. It's like this chapter exists only to draw Qoheleth back into orthodoxy. But is that actually what's going on here, or is it something different? And what's with the really weird extended metaphor of a house falling apart? Well, time to find out. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, Uncut and Unfiltered. This chapter continues the thought from last week about enjoying life while you're young. So we can't just read this chapter on its own. We have to realize that it is coming from the thought of the previous chapter about enjoying life while you still have enough life to enjoy it. So keep that in mind. If you didn't listen to last week's episode yet, or actually now it's 2 weeks ago, because we had our 50th episode last week, which is super exciting. So glad we made it this far and can't wait for what we have in store ahead. But first, we got to finish Ecclesiastes. So if you didn't listen to our Chapter 11 episode, I recommend you go back and do that from a couple weeks ago. But right now, we're just going to look at the first 8 verses here of this chapter because they form one big unit. So keep everything in mind from last week, particularly the last few verses. And now, here we go with Chapter 12. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun, or the light, or the moon, or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men will bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low. And he will rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music will be brought low. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears will be in the way, and the almond tree will flourish, and the grasshopper will be a burden, and desire will fail, because man goes to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitchers be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Hevel of hevels, says the preacher, all is Hevel. Now, you may have noticed that was one very long run-on sentence from verse 1 down to verse 7. So it's a super complicated, very poetic, very complex thought. And it has multiple moving parts. It's really hard to translate over into good English. It's even hard to understand in Hebrew. But we have to keep these verses all together because they are one long extended metaphor. But looking now just at verse 1, let's get into the intro of this. And first, I want to note that he says to remember your Creator in the days of your youth. I think when most people hear that, they're going to think, oh, don't forget about God. Continue to practice religion while you're young. Maybe as you are now moving into adolescence and early adulthood, don't give up on your faith. At least that's the way that I always read it or remember it being taught to me. But that word remember is not necessarily just about a mental thinking of something that you haven't thought about in a long time. It's the same word that shows up in the flood account where God has flooded the earth or the land. You can go back to our Genesis 7 through 11 series for more on that. This is the same word, once God has flooded the land, that he then is said to remember Noah and his family. And we talked in that episode, I think it's chapter 8 or 9 at that point, about how this doesn't necessarily mean that God forgot about Noah or that he just suddenly had to think about it again. The word has more the idea of focusing on, or it can also have the idea of naming. And that's really fascinating to me because of the significance of naming in Genesis 1 through 3, where you have God naming the human naming the animals, and then eventually the woman as well. So it's a constant theme throughout those first few chapters. And there are a surprising number of references to both the creation story and the flood story in this chapter. So I don't think it's any coincidence that we find this word for remembering or naming right when he uses, for the first time in the entire book, the term creator. So I don't think there's any coincidence that we have God referred to as a creator, which is going to hyperlink us back to Genesis 1 through 3. And then he uses this word from the flood account of God's naming Noah, like bringing his name to the front of his mind to do something about it, to act on it. So this is kind of a suggestion that you are going to keep God's name in front of you, which then brings to mind the Shema and the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, or Sinai as we would say in English, where the children of Israel were told to bear God's name a particular way. And this is a whole other discussion we'll actually get in soon when we talk about the Ten Commandments. But the idea of their bearing or carrying God's name is having their identity as his images right there before them, right in front of them as they go throughout their day. So I think this might even be a tie-in there, which would be unique because Qoheleth has not had specific references to the Torah in the book. He has not said anything about obeying the Torah, obeying the law, obeying the commands that Moses received on Sinai. We expect that, particularly in the prophets, sometimes even in the Psalms, but there is very little reference to anything specifically Israelite throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. That's actually part of what I really appreciate about this book, is it then feels more universal. But as we get into this chapter here, we will find some references. They're vague, but I think that they are intended to be little hyperlinks back to the Torah or the law of Moses. So just as the Creator remembered or thought about or named Noah after recreating the earth after the flood, so now we are told to name our Creator or to remember our Creator. So it's actually a reverse of the way it worked in Genesis, which is kind of cool. I also believe there's a purposeful irony in that this chapter deals almost entirely with death, and yet this has God referenced as Creator. So while talking about death's inevitability, we mention or bring back to mind how God gives life in the first place. This is very much a poetic depiction of the circle of life as youth moves into old age and gives way to the next generation of youths. That is a huge theme in this chapter. Let's hear from Douglas Fife in Seeing What Qoheleth Saw. The wise decision people should make is to remember your Creator, while the experience for Qoheleth throughout the book has been that remembering your Creator might not necessarily lead to advantageous outcomes. It is still the best to do so, for gifts only come, if they indeed come at all, from the hand of God. See, this part of the book really trips up a lot of people when they come to it, because so many people read Ecclesiastes as if he has completely removed God from the picture, as if he is only talking about life as if there was absolutely no eternity, no God, no consequence. I even remember hearing this book taught as a depressing depiction of what life is like when you remove God from the equation. But as we've talked about for the last several months now, that's not the problem. In fact, that's the exact opposite of the problem. Qoheleth does believe there is a God. He does account for God in this situation, and that's what causes the problem for him. There is this glitch in the system of life, and if there is a God, there shouldn't be these glitches. We shouldn't be able to find all this gray in the midst of the black and white of books like Proverbs. And yet, here we are. So if I believe there's a God and I believe that life is kind of messed up here, well, how does that work? Why didn't he fix that? Like, that's the whole problem for Qoheleth, is if there's a God, the world shouldn't be working this way. It should be better off than it is. I shouldn't be able to find all these exceptions to the rule. So I think we have to remember, moving into this part here, that Qoheleth has not spoken as if there is no God. He is brutally aware of the fact that there is a God, and that God does not act the way he wishes he would. That God does not always play by the rules. That God is not always predictable. That God is not always doing what Qoheleth thinks he should do according to the laws of life and the universe as far as he can tell them. So we should not be surprised with how much God shows up in this chapter. There are some commentators who think it's such a harsh change of topic from previous chapters that they actually think this chapter was added on, or at least significant parts of it. I don't think that has to be the case. Now, we'll talk when we get down to verses 9 through 14 that is added on by the frame narrator. But even then, he is not in any way diluting or negating what Qoheleth said. So we have to remember, this is still Qoheleth talking here. This is still consistent with his worldview. There is nothing aberrant or weird about his mentioning God here. This has been consistent through the book. In footnotes to Qoheleth, Bruce Heitler points out that there's been somewhat of a debate in Jewish circles of what exactly is going on with the word for creator there, because not all translations will translate that as creator. Many do, especially in English, and the Hebrew word is borekah. But depending on how you put vowels in there, because I was going to say remember, but you might not actually know this, Hebrew was originally a consonantal-only language. So you would write just with the consonants, and the vowels were added in long after in order to simplify writing, because you would have to really know the context of something if all you have is the consonants of a word to go off of. I mean, try it in English. Remove vowels, like just write out consonants of a simple sentence. It's really tough. And especially if you're not the one who wrote it out and then you have to guess what it's saying, you might get it right sometimes, but it's a difficult exercise. So sometimes when we're studying Hebrew, we'll have different suggestions of, oh, well, what if we added these vowels in and it made this word instead? So this is not something we should be scared of. This is not some sort of liberal agenda to change the Bible that people will rant about. No, this is legitimate Bible scholarship that says the original text had only consonants. Sometimes changing the vowels changes the word a little bit. So do we have to go with this particular reading that has just come down through tradition? Or is it possible that changing the vowel slightly makes more sense of the word that was originally here? So we have borekah as the word for creator here, but it's also possible that it could be berekah, which means your well, like your source. So in this case, he'd be saying, remember your source, remember where you came from. Another option is borkah, and that is the word for pit or grave. Now that one fascinates me because Qoheleth is speaking of death in this chapter. So to say, remember now your grave in the days of your youth, remember that you're going to die, even though you're still young, keep this in the front of your mind. I could 100% see that fitting with his topic here. So there's some debate in scholarship over, did Qoheleth mean to say, remember now your creator, remember your source, where you came from, or remember your grave, where you're going? And honestly, any of them would be fair interpretations, and I can't help but think that Qoheleth might have meant a double or triple entendre there to get you thinking of all these. So I'd even encourage you, read this chapter once we're done, once with the reading creator, again with the reading source, and then again with the reading grave, and see how that changes the meaning of the chapter for you, and if you get anything different out of it each time. I'd love to hear what you find. I thought it was really fascinating that when he says, before the years draw nigh, that word for draw nigh is actually the word for touching or striking something. That's a really powerful image to enjoy your young days and to remember your creator or your grave or your source, whatever path you choose there, in your youth before the years strike. I thought that was really poetic. What's even more interesting with that, though, is it's the same word used of Adam and Eve touching the tree to get the fruit from in the garden. So where that's a negative picture in Genesis 1 through 3, this is almost like the tree of life reaching out and striking you instead of reaching out and touching the tree of knowing good and not good. Because as life goes on, you're just struck with the years. So it's almost a reverse image there of Genesis 1 through 3. I can't help but think was purposeful. Now, the end of the verse brings up a question of, what are you not taking pleasure in? And he says, do all this before the years come where you say, I have no pleasure in them. And there's no clear referent there. When it says them, what is that? Is that the years themselves that you no longer enjoy them? Is that your creator? You no longer take pleasure in him? I think it's probably just talking about this whole idea, even going into the verses from the previous chapter, of life itself. Your favorite things, your hobbies, the stuff that you enjoy in your younger years. Well, a lot of times people put them away when they're forced to mature, adult, and grow up. I know this is a little controversial, but I actually really appreciate this about my generation, where we have kind of pushed back against that idea that being an adult means you have to give up everything from your younger years. I see adults now that walk around with backpacks from Marvel movies. I see adults walking around in Star Wars t-shirts or still playing their favorite video games or whatever. I think that can still be really good because it keeps you in touch with a more innocent, creative, simpler side of yourself from your younger years. And if we're honest, most of us still enjoy those things. We don't actually want to give them up. So it's just such an arbitrary idea that just because you're older, you can't anymore wear a t-shirt that has your favorite band on it, or you can't have action figures on your desk at work. Like, no, it's a way of expressing ourselves. And I don't think we actually have to get to a point in life where we no longer have pleasure in these things, as Qoheleth says. Sure, our interests and hobbies will change over the years, but just because you get older doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get cranky and give up all the stuff that you enjoyed earlier in life. You have to get older, but you don't have to get old. You can still try to find new things to enjoy. Stretch yourself by trying some new food or listening to some new music or putting on a movie you haven't seen before or reading from a new author or anything just to keep yourself fresh. It doesn't have to be that you lose interest as the years go on, in the words of Qoheleth here. John Sawyer wrote an article called The Ruined House in Ecclesiastes 12, a reconstruction of the original parable. It's a little bit tedious of an article, but it does really help to illuminate some of the difficult parts of this chapter. So if I reference Sawyer in this episode, which I will a handful of times, it's going to be that specific article. And the first thing that I wanted to draw on that he pointed out is that this chapter brings up 3 things that can derail your enjoyment of life from the previous chapter. So you're supposed to live it up before these 3 things happen. First thing, you can lose interest. So that's what we just talked about. Second, and this is going to be the next verse, the opportunity can pass. And then third, death may come unexpectedly. So he kind of lays out the next several verses in those 3 categories for us. Now that we've got that set up, it's time to get into the extended metaphor he uses for the next several verses. Before I say anything about this part of the chapter, I would love to hear from you all what you think this part means. Like if you've heard this preached before, or if you've read it in devotional or what have you, how was this taught to you, or how have you perceived this? When he talks about the sun, the light, the moon, the stars being darkened, the keepers in the house trembling, the grinders ceasing, how has that been presented to you? What do you think of? And I'll give you a second. You can comment in the socials or on YouTube. Let us know. I am really curious to hear how other people have been taught this passage. Because the way that I always heard it is that this is the metaphor for the body breaking down. So he has this super extended metaphor here where we try to take each bit of this and say, what part of the body is he talking about? So when he says that the sun, the light, the moon, the stars are darkened, that means that the eyes are darkened. You know, you get more blind as you get older, so you can't see as well. The keepers of the house will tremble. That can be any number of things. I've heard different parts of the face. I've heard the arms, the legs. Usually I think that one's the arms, and then people say the strong men that bow themselves, that's the legs, or maybe a bowed over back. The grinders cease because they're few. That means your teeth fall out. The windows be darkened, so we're back to eyes again. The doors shut in the streets. This is where it starts getting weird, because then you realize, or at least you should realize, that the metaphor starts to fall apart. And this is where you get multiple different interpretations. Like, pick up any commentary or listen to any sermon on this chapter, and this is where the analogy really starts to fall apart, and it doesn't make sense what part of the body they're trying to connect to. Doors shutting in the street. And then why does this mention grinding again? Why did the end of verse 3 mention windows being darkened when verse 2 talked about there being no light? Why would it mention blindness twice or dimming eyesight twice? And then what's the whole deal with them being afraid of that which is high? Are all old people scared of heights? That just sounds a little generic and kind of ageist. Like, why are we making these generalizations about all old people? It doesn't feel right. And then we start getting into the almond tree and the grasshopper and desire, and at that point you just go, what the heck? You throw up your hands. And then you get to verse 6 that talks about the silver cord being loosed and the golden bowl being broken, and like, I completely give up. I have no clue how to connect this to the body anymore. But some commentators still try to. Now, although that is by far the most common interpretation, and it does have some ancient precedent, I don't think that's the best explanation for these verses. I'm not going to say it's entirely wrong. I have seen too much ancient commentary on it that leans that way to think it's completely invalid, but any use of this as an analogy for a decomposing body, or just as you age, an aging body, I don't think it's consistent. It's going to try to make too much of certain points. It's going to really stretch the metaphor at other points. So I think it's just too forced into this chapter. I think there are better ways to go about it. And there is a whole litany of options of how to interpret this. In a couple thousand years, there have been so many different options. In the interpretation commentary, Brown lists some of them. He says, interpreters, both ancient and modern, have taken 12, 1 through 8 in various ways as a description of the aging body, a crumbling house, an approaching thunderstorm, a passing funeral, or some combination thereof. Most recently, another commentator named Sal has argued that Qoheleth's final words depict nothing short of the eschatological destruction of the cosmos. So basically, end of time, Armageddon, dogs and cats living together, locusts, all of that. The problem, however, with each interpretation is the strained attempt to limit the poem's connotations primarily to a single setting. On the one hand, the poem foils any strict allegorical reading by which the literal images are meant to be discarded for some hidden constellation of meaning. It's impossible to discern, for example, a point-by-point correspondence between every image in the poem and some aspect of the aging body. On the other hand, the images presented by Qoheleth are fraught with background. That's an understatement. The distinct lack of consistency among the various images defies any attempt at establishing some univocal setting, be it cosmic or individual, funerary or domestic. Let me add a couple more options to Brown's list here. Rome, a very important early Christian commentator and translator. He lived about 350 years-ishly after Jesus. He translated the Bible into Latin, where we get the Vulgate. So at one point he was commenting on this. He wrote commentaries on pretty much every part of the Bible. And so this was his insight into this. The Hebrews suppose that the command pertains to Israel, to whom it is commanded to enjoy their resources before the time of captivity comes and they exchange youth for old age. So now he's going to go on and present this reading of the chapter as if the analogy is speaking not of an aging body, but actually of Israel going into exile. And he's saying that this was a popular Jewish interpretation in his day. Rejoice therefore in your youth, O Israel, and do these things previously mentioned before the captivity comes, and before your honor and glory depart, and your judges and holy men are carried off, who are compared to the sun, moon, and stars, before Nebuchadnezzar comes, or Titus, son of Vespasian, summoned by the prophets, and before their prophecies are fulfilled. On that day on which the guardian angels of the temple will depart, and the most powerful in your army will be thrown into confusion, and the precepts of the teachers will become useless, and the prophets will become dark who used to be able to receive the light of their visions. When the doors of the temple are closed, and Jerusalem is humbled, and the Chaldeans come, summoned by calls of Jeremiah, just like the singing of a bird and the daughters of song, the choruses of those singing in the temple become silent. And I'll stop there. It goes on for a while longer. But you could hear him drawing on some of the language of this chapter, but using it as an analogy for Israel's captivity in Babylon. Matthew Krause in Christian Jews and Pagans in Dialogue, Jerome on Ecclesiastes 12, 1-7, compared this language to how the decline of empires had been described in some other works. And then he also pointed out that Jerome used it to suggest the passing of Judaism into Christianity. So there is a little bit of, maybe not anti-Semitism, but at very least he was not fully understanding the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Jerome was very much a supersessionist, where he saw the church replace Israel. So we do have to be careful of that part of his reading of it. But it's just interesting to see all the different possible interpretations people have laid out over the years. Brown goes on to mention the scene as a picture of domesticity, specifically a household under attack. And he compared the guards of the house and the strong men on contradistinction to the women of valor in Proverbs 31. And he also draws on Proverbs 9, 1-6. Wisdom is said to have built her house. So once we strip away the idea that this has to be a forced metaphor of old age, we can just appreciate the poetry of a house falling into disrepair. And Brown is drawing on how wisdom literature, particularly Proverbs, has a lot of imagery of building your house, and of a wise person building a particular type of house and avoiding other houses. And it really makes me think that this is the sort of passage that Jesus had on his mind when he said that the wise man builds his house on the rock and the foolish on the sand. Sawyer explains it well. A frequent figure in biblical tradition, especially in the wisdom literature, is that of a house, representing human achievements or success in terms of domestic security and contentment, and failure in terms of the collapse of a house. The best known example is the parable of the wise and foolish builders at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The same contrast underlies the conclusion of the first part of the book of Proverbs, where wisdom's house is built with 7 pillars. Go figure, right? But it's contrasted then with the sinister house of folly, whose guests are in the depths of Sheol. Qoheleth here quotes a similar proverb, apparently as a comment on the fate of a country ruined by the inexperience and dissoluteness of its young rulers. So there he's drawing back from Ecclesiastes 10 and the whole idea of a land being overturned when its rulers are unjust or perhaps even inexperienced. So he's drawing a comparison or perhaps a link between chapter 10 and chapter 12, which I had not made that connection on my own, and I think it's definitely one worth pursuing. What really stood out to me is that this is strong decreation language, like anti-creation, the exact opposite of creation, right after we have God referred to as the creator. So this can't be coincidental. I think he is very purposefully taking this language straight out of Genesis 1-3, but using it in reverse. Because think of the creation account with me. What did God create? Light, the sun, the moon, the stars. What does this start with? When the sun, the light, the moon, or the stars being darkened. And then he talks about plants a few verses later. He talks about the sound of birds. I think these are all creation hyperlinks, but used in a decreation way. That just as creation built up to a crescendo in days 1-7, so life is almost like the reverse of that. We start off at day 7 of creation, then we almost work backwards in our life, back into darkness and chaos, and then eventually nothingness, at least in this ancient mindset of just going to Sheol or the grave. That's a dark picture, and I think that's even why he says this enjoyment of life and remembering of your creator. I'm just going to say creator from this point on, but understand I'm using that just because it's the most common translation. We can take it as creator, source, or grave, however you want to read it. But rather than saying creator/source/grave for the rest of the episode, I'll just say creator there. So enjoy life and remember your creator before the clouds don't return after the rain. Now, that's a little confusing the way it's worded in English, but return here doesn't mean to come back, but actually to go away. So to return not back here to us, but the clouds then return to the place that they came from. You can have a perfectly clear day, no clouds in the sky, and then the clouds appear, and then they're gone. And so in Qoheleth's mindset, that's saying that the clouds then have returned, not returned to us, but returned to where they came from. So in this verse where he says that you're eventually going to reach a point where the clouds no longer return, that's not a good thing. He's actually painting a negative picture here because that means the clouds never go away. And that imagery hit a button in the therapist part of my brain that said, what about those people that live as if the clouds never go away? You know, the sort of person who just feels like there's always that cloud over them and their life, that they can't seem to escape that dreary, drowsy, depressed feeling. And that's something that can happen to people even just as they get older. I think that's what he's talking about here, where there's kind of that sadness, that melancholy that can set in as the years go by and you start to realize that you have more of your life behind you than you do ahead of you. Can you learn to be okay when you're not actually okay? Can you learn to find, I hate to use this term post-COVID with how much it got used, but can you find a new normal as things have changed in life, as you're no longer able to do what you used to do in your younger years, and you're no longer able to get around as well as you can, or see as well as you used to, or hear as well as you used to, or stay up and party like you used to? You know, life is constantly changing. We are constantly changing, and we get so used to one way of doing things that we can get depressed and discouraged when that's no longer an option. But we have to realize that's just part of the cycle of life. And that's why Qoheleth says to live it up while you're young, because most of us aren't going to be able to do at 50 or 60 or 70 the stuff that we could do at 15, 20, and 30. That's just a normal part of life. So if you spend all of your young years saving all of your energy and money up and never actually enjoying life because you want to keep some money in the bank and you don't want to make any mistakes, well, you're not actually helping yourself, because when you get to a certain age, you're not going to be able to enjoy it anymore anyway. So then you'll have completely missed out on those opportunities. Now, I do think it's worth mentioning here that getting older is not an entirely bad thing. It's not like the most miserable thing in the world, which I think it's possible to read Qoheleth that way, when I don't think that's what he's saying. He is not saying, oh, getting old is the worst thing ever because then you never enjoy anything. No, you can still very much enjoy life. And like we said earlier, especially if you try to stay fresh, learn new things, watch new things, listen to new things, you can keep yourself younger even as your body ages. So we shouldn't be reading this as just saying that old age is a completely miserable time of your life. But Qoheleth does point out that so many people are just pushing things later into life. We're waiting for retirement to live. Those are our golden years, right? While there's nothing wrong with saving some money and living it up a bit when you get older, if you can, there's no guarantee that you will be able to. Sometimes people just keep saving money and time and energy and never taking that vacation because there's no right time. Well, there is no right time. There is no easy time. There will always be something else that came up. And so I think what Qoheleth is really trying to say with all this is just, if you have the opportunity and you have the resources, take it. You're going to regret more the stuff you didn't do in life than the stuff you did do. If you have the time and money and ability to take that trip or start that hobby or whatever it is that you want to do it. Even if the situation isn't perfect, even if you have to scrounge a few pennies, even if you have to, take all your time off for this year for work, you're not going to have a perfect opportunity. So make the perfect opportunity. And again, I'm not saying be wasteful if you have a bunch of debt. I'm not saying go to Disney World. But if you have the opportunity, and sure, it's not perfect, but it's good enough and you can make it work and enjoy life while you still have the chance to. That's what he's trying to say here, is that it never gets easier. It never gets cheaper. You never end up with more time. You never end up with more ability than you have today. In fact, those things tend to go down as the years move on. So enjoy it while you can and live life as much as you can, as long as you can. Looking back at Sawyer's work, he points out the elaborate parallelism and poetic flourish in the Hebrew of these few verses. It's very complex, but it's a beautiful work of art. And this whole metaphor of a house being destroyed over time, this is something Sawyer says is often used in wisdom literature to show the consequence of human folly. But Qoheleth uses the metaphor as the fate we all risk experiencing as a part of life. Notice in this, nothing says that the house falls apart because people didn't keep up with it. It's just the house is going to fall apart, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so Sawyer says no one is exempt from this, be they men, women, the strong, or slaves, all face the third law of thermodynamics. And so he's drawing on all the different people mentioned here in these verses. I mentioned before that even though I don't personally see this as fully a metaphor for aging, it is a common interpretation for a long, long time. And so there's a story in the Jewish Babylonian Talmud, specifically Tractate Shabbat Folio 152a, that uses similar descriptive language to describe aging. So I thought I would throw this in here, even though it's not my view of it. I thought it was an interesting connection you can make. The emperor asked Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, "Why did you not attend the Be'avadan? The mountain is snowy, and it is surrounded by ice. The dog does not bark, and the grinders do not grind," he replied. So when this emperor asked this rabbi why he didn't make it to this specific event, he basically says, "I'm too old. I don't get around like I used to." But what was really a fascinating connection for me is that he mentions the grinders not grinding, and that's the same picture that Qoheleth has here. Now, the way that Qoheleth words it, though, is a little hard to follow because he says the grinders cease because they are few. If we're talking about a house falling into disrepair, it's hard to understand why having fewer women grinding flour would lead to the work stopping. It would make more sense if you have fewer women doing that for them to work harder because there are fewer women doing that. So it could be possible that it's just saying that the grinders cease or fail because they have too few of them to do any work. So it's like, we're not making any headway, so we're just going to stop altogether. Or perhaps even just the women aren't there to do that job at all. So again, there's so many different ways that you can read this, but I think it's important we keep the main focus on the metaphor itself of the house breaking down. We shouldn't be trying to say, oh, the grinders have to equal teeth, or the sun and light darkening has to equal the eyes. No, I think it's just helpful to view this as the metaphor of a house breaking down, falling apart, falling into disrepair, just like as life goes on. This is kind of the cycle of life. This is what human beings experience. Another oddity in the way Qoheleth words it is that those who look out of the windows will be darkened. That doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Like, it could make sense if you say they couldn't see out of the windows, but why is it the people who are darkened instead of what they see be darkened? That's really strange, and I'm still trying to figure that one out. So if you can imagine anything that he might be trying to say with that, I would love to hear your ideas on this, because I'm really not sure why he says that the ones looking out the window are darkened instead of what they see is darkened. I did notice it's the same word darkened from the previous verse, and that windows is not a very common word in the Tanakh, but it is used in the flood story with the ark and the little window or opening that was built there. So there we go again, having another connection to the flood story. The part in verse 4 at the beginning of the doors being shut in the streets, it's this cracked me up at how much commentators have written about the plural of doors there. And Murphy, in particular, in the Word Biblical Commentary, said that A&E, Ancient Near Eastern Homes, would have only had one door. So he was like, why are there multiple doors referenced here? I don't understand why commentators have spent so much time talking about this, because I think the idea is just of an entire street full of houses. Interestingly, several commentators or translators have taken it to mean double doors at a bazaar, like a marketplace area that closes down. So that's another possible way that you can read this. Brown says, Qoheleth's Ode to Death moves from the domestic setting to the public arena. The cessation of all commercial activity is marked by the closing of the double doors of the bazaar. There you go. The familiar sound of the mill, in turn, falls to an inaudible level. The grim scene marks the collapse of the marketplace. Given his harsh critique of the self-absorbed economic realities of his day, the demise of the marketplace is of particular significance for Qoheleth, signifying nothing less than the desolation of society as he knows it. See, this is why I like reading it this way instead of just as a metaphor for aging. Because when you're so focused on trying to figure out what part of the analogy refers to what part of the body, you miss out on these connections of, like how several chapters back, Qoheleth was talking about the economy and the marketplace and casting your bread on the waters and business advice and your presence before a king and all this different stuff. And so now he's drawing all these threads back together. It's like he's pulling the notes throughout the symphony back now to a conclusion and bringing it all to a crescendo. So he's tying up all the loose ends of his previous discussion. Sawyer, this is where I think his article really started helping me understand the chapter. He saw a change in the referent here from a human to nature. See, most people, when they read this, they think that it's talking about a human throughout all of these verses. But here in verse 4, he thinks that it's no longer talking about a human in analogy, but actually nature itself. And I realize that might not make a ton of sense right now, but let me explain as we go on here. He talks about the voice of the bird arising. Now, this is where it's a little bit different, because most English translations will say he will rise up at the voice of the bird. So that's where they read a human there. But Sawyer says, no, this isn't talking about a human. We need to switch which one is the subject here. It's actually the voice of the bird that arises, not the human that arises at the voice of the bird. You say, well, what the heck difference does that make? Well, it starts to make more sense of the rest of this verse and then the next couple of verses as well, because they focus more on nature. So it makes sense to use this as a pivot where now nature is being talked about. And note that it is only when the noise of human industry quiets down that we hear the sounds of nature. It's only once the house has fallen into disrepair and the women are no longer grinding out flour and the doors are shut for the bazaar, only then are you able to hear nature again. I'm not sure that's Qoheleth's focus, but it's such a poignant picture. I've grown up in a very suburban area. We're very close to Philadelphia. I'm used to the hustle and bustle of a city, but it's only when you get away from all of it, you're just in the woods, you don't hear even a car drive by, that you can really start to appreciate the sounds of nature. And we all need that from time to time. We all need to step away from technology and modern civilization, even if it's just for a couple hours of a hike in the woods. There's just something so healing about that reconnects us with nature. I'm a person who likes city life. I like the busyness. I like the craziness. I like all the flashing lights and the noises and all of that. But isn't it so interesting how much we praise human achievement there? And something as simple as a bird singing seems so basic and benign compared to the glories of what we can create as a society. And yet, it's our buildings that collapse. And yet, when that happens, the birds are there, still living their life, still chirping out their songs. We think that we have it all established. We think that we have come so far as a species. And in many ways we have. And yet it's the simple things in life that haven't changed that much. And yet they're still beautiful. And they outlast us. So for Sawyer, when he reads the end of this verse, that the daughters of music will be brought low, he compares that to Psalm 69:13, where fools mock another person's suffering, and he sees the birds as then mocking or talking about the dilapidated remains of man's efforts. And so as he moves into verse 5, he reads the birds as the ones looking down from the sky. So like the King James reads, also when they will be afraid of that which is high. And it makes it sound as if it's talking about an old person who's afraid of heights. The Hebrew word for seeing and the Hebrew word for fearing are relatively similar, and depending on the way that the word is spelled out, depending on the tense and everything like that, you can change it around to where one word might actually end up being the other. This is kind of like the vowel pointing thing that we talked about earlier. Depending on exactly how you spell it when you add in the vowels, you might end up with one or the other. So Sawyer is thinking that this isn't talking about fear of heights, but actually birds looking down from on high. And to me, that makes more sense of why then the next part says fears or terrors are in the way. If it talks about fear of heights first and then fears being in the way, I don't quite understand why there is mention of fear twice there side by side. But if the first one's just talking about birds looking down on us from above, and then it brings in fear, that makes a little more sense to me. And Sawyer saw this word for terror or fear in several different verses in the wisdom literature of the Bible as a conventional term to denote the salutary downfall of the fool. So he took that to mean that humans haven't actually changed anything in the natural order. Yes, we've built great buildings and we've accomplished so much, yet life goes on without us. Here's how he explains the next part of the verse, where it starts to get really weird about the almond tree flourishing and the grasshopper being a burden and desire failing. He says, first, the Hebrew word for almond tree looks like it's related to the word for awake or watch, and it's been popularly explained by reference to the fact that it is the first tree to blossom in winter. It's thus an ideal symbol for the reawakening of nature after the house is deserted. So here we go with that theme popping up again. Second, locusts, a threat to gardens and estates in many parts of the world, are easily frightened away when there's enough people about. But if there's no one left to look after the garden and the estate is abandoned, the locusts are free to settle and eat their fill. Third, caperberries. Now, I just want to step in here for a second and say that's the word that the King James translates as desire, but it's actually a word for a particular type of plant called a caperberry. The way we get to desire is because caperberries were supposedly seen as aphrodisiacs in the ancient world. So by the time we get to the Geneva Bible in English, it translates this clause as concupiscence shall be driven away. So you're getting the idea of sexual desire or lust is no longer going to exist. And as you can imagine, this is where people step in with the aging metaphor again and suggest that it's depicting libido decreasing as the years go by. It's possible, and in many cases, accurate to a degree, but I think if we just stick with the metaphor of the house falling apart and now nature taking over, it makes sense just to keep this translated as caperberry, because we're talking about nature here. So fail might not actually be the best translation for the verb here. It's more so talking about breaking down something or breaking into something. So I think the image is of the caperberry as an invasive plant taking over the now dilapidated house. So the King James and other similar translations weren't necessarily wrong here. They were just presenting their interpretation into the passage as a translation instead of actually just translating what it said. Back to Sawyer. Caperberries grow on a straggling plant, rather like a bramble, which is commonly to be found among rocks, on ancient walls, and in deserted places. The author, just like the author of Proverbs 24:31, has selected three common features of a neglected garden, and with poignant brevity and originality, presented them as symbols of nature's unconcern at the downfall of man. Then we return to verse 5, the third part. Its grammatical relation to what precedes is not clear, but there is a striking correspondence between the thoughts of verse 5c and that of the passage as a whole. As we've seen, the parable presents a contrast between the downfall of man on the one hand and indifferent nature on the other. Is it possible that the same contrast is intended in 5c? When a man dies and goes to his eternal home, the activities of professional mourners going round the streets touting for custom increase. The verb to go round is used 6 times by Qoheleth, twice of his own vain attempts to find some meaning in life, and twice of the wind going pointlessly round and round. Perhaps he saw in the mourner's activities, which increase when a person dies, a further example of this eerie theme. If this is what the author originally intended, and it certainly would make the verse an extraordinarily effective conclusion to the parable, then the next step would be to take 5c as the point of reference for the simile in verses 3 through 5b. As when man is ruined and his house deserted, nature is unmoved. So when man dies, life in the city goes on unchanged. This is then how Sawyer translates these couple of verses. As when servants leave a house and men of property are ruined, the women who grind the flour stop work, the few that remain, and the ladies appear at the windows no more. The street doors are shut, and the sound of grinding fades away. Then the sound of birds singing can be heard, and all the chattering songbirds look down upon it from the sky, a ruin by the roadside, where almond trees blossom, locusts eat their fill, and caper berries grow. So when a man goes to his eternal home, the mourners in the streets continue their ceaseless rounds. End quote. I like that translation. It really makes sense of a couple of really difficult verses, at least for me. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you if that translation helped you understand this, or if you're still having a little difficulty with it, or if you found something else that helps you make sense of these verses. Let us know. I also want to point out that some commentators think, and I would agree on this case, that locust, or what the King James has as grasshopper in the middle of the verse, is not a reference to the bug, but actually to the plant. And it's possible that the Hebrew word for locust here can refer both to the insect and to the plant. Just like in English, we have the same word for locust and the locust plant. So that's a little bit of a weird connection. We don't usually have that same one-for-one correspondence in English and Hebrew like that. But I tend to think, since he's talking about almond trees and caper berries, that it only makes sense that the second item in that list of three would also be a plant. It doesn't make a ton of sense, at least in my mind, to just insert an insect into a list of two other plants. One other thing I should point out before we get any further, the King James toward the end of the verse says, because man goes to his long home. That one really puzzles me, why they went for that translation. Because long, the word that they have there for long, it's olam, which a few of you may remember we've talked about before as the word for, well, most people would say eternity, but actually an age. And this is where I think it's important to remember that the ancient Near Eastern Hebrews did not have the idea of eternity the exact same way we do. They had the age which is, and then the age which is to come in the future when God is going to set everything right, get us back to Eden. So this is literally because a human, and it's that word for Adam, because Adam, a man, a human, is going to his house of the age. That's such a poetic way to talk about the grave. You are going to your house of eternity, your house of the age. You are passing into the next age, the age which will be. So long home isn't really an inaccurate translation. I mean, you're going to be dead longer than you were alive, but it's just such a weird way to put it. I'm not sure why they went there. Fox focused in on the end of this verse that mentions the mourners going about in the streets and used that to interpret this whole metaphor as actually being about a funeral procession from beginning to end. So that was a little bit of an interesting take on it. You can read more in his work on Ecclesiastes here. And I'll add a note into our show notes where Murphy goes into more detail about the ways that people try to read verse 5 in light of the typical age metaphor. It gets a little weird, and I think it's worth adding in, but it's a little much to read right now, so I'll just put that in the show notes. I think the main thing we should be focusing on here is that each of these three things pulled out, the almond tree, the locust plant, and the caper berry, renew with each generation, just like we as humans do. The creature itself may die. The plant will freeze. It will die in the fall and freeze in the winter. But the collective lives on. Not that exact same plant, a little bit of a different version of it, but there will be sprouts of the same sort of plant again in the spring, and it will thrive again in the summer. And so we, as humans, the individual will die, fall will come, winter will come, but then so will spring and summer. The collective lives on. We are bigger than ourselves. As Bart Ehrman frequently observes, the amount of time in history that you didn't exist is far greater than the little time you've existed now. And if that doesn't bother you, why should the fact that it'll happen again bother you? In other words, you never stop and worry about the fact that you didn't exist for thousands of years before this. So why do we worry so much about the fact that we're not going to exist thousands of years after this? If it didn't bother you before that you weren't born, it's not going to bother you after that you did. We focus so much on the parts of history that we're not a part of that we can miss out on just enjoying the little part of history that we do get to be a part of. It reminded me of one of those goofy tombstone inscriptions that you can see sometimes online, and it said, "Once I wasn't, then I was, and now I ain't again." It's so simple and stupid, but there's some wisdom to that. There's some truth and poetry to that. We as individuals are not the center of the world. We feel like it, but life is going to continue on without us. Somehow humans have survived for thousands of years now. We have made it through some horrible tragedies and crises and world wars now, and yet we're still here despite all of that. So, no matter how bad things may look in your lifetime, either personally or as a collective, we're going to keep going. We're going to survive. We're going to find a way forward. We always have. We always will. And that's something that we can individually take comfort in because it means that life isn't about us. I know that might sound depressing for some people, but it's more depressing to think that life is about you because then you're worried about failing and messing up with your life. If you stop and realize life isn't actually about me, there's less pressure to get it all right. It's okay if you mess some stuff up. It's okay if you have to start back over from square one because you haven't thrown off the balance of the universe. You haven't thrown off the emperor's groove, all right? It's okay. He's got his own life. You've got your own life. So if we'll just stop with the delusions of grandeur and realize that while we are not unimportant, we are also not the center of the universe, and the human race and life itself will continue on without us. That is actually an encouraging thought because then we get to reevaluate the concerns and worries and stresses of our own life in light of the vastness of eternity. You ever just sit out in an open field on a nice cloudless night, stare up at the stars, and think about how small we are in light of the entire universe out there? Well, that's healthy every once in a while to think about that. It reminds us that our problems, while real and legitimate, are not as world-ending as they seem. And just like we've gotten through all of our seemingly world-ending issues up to this point in life and been okay, we'll get through this one as well, and the next one, and the next one, and then one day, our turn on this planet will be over, but humanity is going to continue, and we get to be a part of moving that forward, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just in little moments of joy with friends and family, or even at work. That is a life well lived. That is increasing the goodness in the world and pushing back a little bit against the chaotic Hevel that tries to encroach itself upon us. Verse 6 is a pretty strange one. It defies most interpretation. This is the silver cord being loosed, the golden bowl being broken, the pitcher broken at the fountain, and the wheel broken at the cistern. Let's turn to Murphy for some help in understanding this. He says we have this weird word galgal, which means wheel, and here presumably a pulley. Others argue for bowl. The picture is that of a well with a broken pulley and a smashed jar that served to carry the water. And different commentators will debate whether the first half of verse 6 goes with the second half of verse 6 or if they're separate ideas, but Murphy argues that they should be read together as a metaphor for death. The light of the lamp is gone, and the water of the well is unavailable. This view recognizes two distinct images, a golden lamp and a broken down cistern or well. Others would put these together in one picture, as Fox, who thinks that the verse claims to picture three vessels suspended by a cord over a well. The cord snaps, and the vessels fall and shatter. However, it's difficult to consider a golden lamp and silver cord as functioning at a fountain. The metaphor itself is a lamp that is presumably empty of fire, thus symbolizing death. As the biblical phrase has it, one's lamp goes out in Proverbs 13:9. The image is thus different from the severing of the cord or thread of life in Greek mythology. So there he's saying that some people have tried to draw a connection to the silver thread of life in Greek mythology, but he doesn't think that it should actually be connected. I was crazy surprised to not find a single commentator that pointed out the word for rope, or what the King James has as cord at the beginning of the verse, is the word kevel. do you notice a similarity to a key word from Ecclesiastes? How about hevel? It's the exact same word, just with a chet instead of a het. It's very similar in Hebrew. In fact, the letters look almost identical, and the only difference is whether or not you clear your throat with the letter. So you have a het and a chet. And hevel is spelled just with the het. You hear that in the H sound. But then hevel is with that chet, that little throat clearing in there, that guttural sound. So I think this is a very specifically chosen word to play off of the idea of hevel a little bit. The Lexham Textual Notes on the Bible points out that we should probably use the word removed instead of snapped, or as the King James had, loosed at the start of this year. So it should be that the silver rope has been removed instead of it being snapped or loose. Now, the word used to describe the golden bowl being broken is oddly enough the same word used to describe Jacob and Esau fighting with each other in the womb. It's also used of the prophets of Egypt being broken under God's judgment. So it's kind of a rich word when it comes to meaning from earlier stories within the Bible. I can't help but think that there could be some hyperlinks there. As I was doing the study, I came across a really fascinating reading in the Jewish Talmud that explains this verse as part of a mortuary practice where, quote, one may put cooling vessels and metal vessels in the corpse's stomach and plug his orifices, and concerning him Solomon said, before the silver cord snaps. Now, I'm not sure that's what Qoheleth had in mind, or even how practical or common this practice was, but this particular tradition is saying that sometimes they would take these specific metal bowls and put them along different parts of a corpse's body as part of their embalming rituals. It's really strange, but I thought that was just worth pulling out since it was connected to this verse. Again, I want to point out, though, that we don't need to allegorize this to appreciate the analogy of the fragility of life. Some other commentators have connected the verse to a possible ancient Near Eastern mourning ritual of breaking pottery at a funeral. And remember back in verse 1 where we talked about the different options for creator and how one of them, depending on how you vocalized it, could be the word for pit or grave? Well, that word shows up here at the very end with what the King James calls a cistern. A cistern would be a pit dug to collect rainwater. But that word pit is also a common metaphor in the Tanakh for grave. So that's a very interesting reading here, and that, I think, could round out, almost as an inclusio, the first part of this chapter, and now the end of this extended metaphor, as we have potentially grave or pit showing up here at both the beginning and end. Verse 7 then puts a cap on this whole section and really much of the book, where he says, then will the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. And this could even be read as a jussive, as an acceptance of fate. May the dust now return to the earth as it was, and may the spirit return to God who gave it. Before anyone makes too much of the end of that verse about the spirit returning to God who gave it, we should read what Murphy says. This is a picture of dissolution, not of immortality, as if there were a reditus anime ad deum, the return of the soul to God. There is no question of the soul here, but of life breath, a totally different category of thought. I think he's right. That word spirit, it's the word ruach again. So we shouldn't be thinking of this in Christian terms. We don't want to read a Christian perspective back into an ancient Hebrew document. This is not saying, oh, when you die, your spirit goes up to heaven and you're with God forever. No, this is talking more so of a return of your life breath, your life essence to the Creator. This is very much circle of life mindset, that just as someone is going to be breathing their last today, so someone else is going to be breathing their first today. So the very breath and life essence that you have then returns in Genesis 1 and 2 terminology to the God who breathed it into us as dust. So again, there you go with some huge creation hyperlinks. I also don't think that we need to read this as a contradiction of Ecclesiastes 3:21, where he talked about who knows whether the spirit of a human goes upward or the spirit of a beast goes downward, because there he was talking about human life versus animal life and not knowing if anything actually comes beyond this life, where here he is speaking poetically about the end of life. So I think these are two separate categories, and we shouldn't go, oh, he said before that we don't know if the spirit of a human goes up, and here he says the spirit returns to God. Remember, we're not talking about spirit in a Christian sense. We're just talking about life breath returning in the cycle of life to the Genesis 1 starting point. So that, as we talked about the whole extended metaphor of while human creations die off, nature continues on, and humanity even reinvents itself, very much like a phoenix rising from its own ashes the next day. We continue in this cycle. There is always death happening, and there is always new life happening, and we just kind of continue rolling forward as a species. Brown goes on, Qoheleth's discourse ends on a remarkably cathartic note, with the person's life breath returning to God. The eternal sleep of death serves as a wake-up call to live and welcome the serendipities of the present. As in chapter 1, verse 4, the earth remains the same, receiving back what it was taken from it to create life. The earth does not dissolve away. Qoheleth's ode to death does not so much revel in the eschatological travails of cosmic destruction, although such hyperbole is employed, as document the natural outcome of life for each and every individual. Recalling the Primal Garden story, this final verse in the poem poignantly depicts the natural outcomes of life, the return of an individual's life to its genesis as a necessary part of life. A generation goes, but another comes. For Qoheleth, the death of the individual bears cosmic significance. And I love this so much. This is biblical theology at its finest. Qoheleth has found a way to take the sting out of death, and it begins by accepting death's victory and living accordingly. All right, now you have to hop along the ride here for a second. Let's follow out Brown's train of thought. He was referencing 1 Corinthians 15:55. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? Now, if you've been in church any length of time, I'm guessing you're probably familiar with that phrase, as it is a popular part of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. But it's not new to him. This is an idea found all the way back in Qoheleth, where you have to die, in a sense. You have to accept death in order to live abundantly. That's been Qoheleth's whole message here. Is that not the same thing that Paul says? You need to die to yourself, right? You need to take up your cross. You need to identify with the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus in order to live out this new spiritual, eternal life that you are given in Jesus. That's Paul's theology, but he is drawing on very ancient Jewish theology. It's not new to him. This whole Christian idea of victory and life coming only through death is exactly the same thing that we have here in Ecclesiastes. Only through recognizing, appreciating, even moving toward the reality of death and accepting it are you able to truly live. Life always comes out of death. Is that not what Jesus himself is recorded as saying in the Gospels? That lest a seed fall into the ground, it is not able to sprout. It has to die, in a sense, in order for it to live again, in order for it to sprout and become useful. So we as human beings have to die in order to live. And that gets wrapped up in so much churchy terminology where we think dying to ourselves means giving up on all the enjoyable things in life. And I think Qoheleth would say, no, it's the exact opposite. You don't have to give up enjoying life. You just have to give up the idea that enjoying life is going to give you some greater meaning or purpose or something that's going to last beyond the grave or even last beyond this moment. There is nothing that lasts beyond this moment because nothing is promised beyond this moment. So what has to die is our delusions of grandeur. What has to die is our demands for some greater meaning than just the beautiful moment that we have right now. What has to die is our notion that life must act according to certain black and white principles. It's only when we live in the gray that we live at all. Life always and only comes through death. We should not be surprised then when Jesus comes on the scene and starts speaking in this language, or Paul uses this terminology. They were not coming up with any new ideas. These are very ancient wisdom ideas. And Brown, in his commentary, even went to draw a comparison to Dickens' Ebenezer Scrooge in The Christmas Carol, who needed to be confronted with death before he learned how to live. And we are very much the same way. Murphy found a quote in the Studies of Sumerian Proverbs by Bent Alster. So this is a reference to an ancient Sumerian proverb that has some correlation to the metaphor Qoheleth has used. My grain roasting fails. Now my youthful vigor, strength, and personal god have left my loins like an exhausted donkey. My black mountain has produced white gypsum. My mother has brought in a man from the forest. He gave me captivity. My mongoose, which used to eat strong-smelling things, does not stretch its neck towards beer and butter. Oh, there's so much you could talk about there. My urine used to flow in a strong torrent, but now you flee from my wind. Okay, I just wish that the crotchety, cranky people who always like to comment about how vulgar today's culture is, and we didn't talk like that back in our day. Okay, well, this is thousands of years old, and this guy is talking about how he used to be able to pee faster, and now you flee from my wind. Okay, just think about that for a minute. Okay, people have not changed in thousands of years. We continue to talk about these things. Don't pretend like your generation didn't. He goes on with the quote, my child whom I used to feed with butter and milk, I can no more support it. I have had to sell my little slave girl, and an evil demon makes me sick. So this is kind of a ridiculous example, at least in the language he uses, and at least to us. Who knows? Maybe someone reading it back then would have had more familiarity with these analogies, but it's quite amusing reading it today out of context. But you can see how he describes aging and the dwindling down of life in very poetic terms. Let's check out verse 8 now. Hevel of Hevels, says Qoheleth, all is Hevel. You'll remember back to our early episodes in this series where we mentioned that there's more than one voice in Ecclesiastes. Qoheleth takes up the majority of it, but we have this frame narrator at the beginning and end who gives some introductory and concluding thoughts. And different commentators will suggest that he comes in at different times, and we've talked about that throughout the series. Some commentators will even suggest that there is more than one frame narrator voice, and that as we get into these last few verses of the chapter, there may even be 2 or 3 people adding on thoughts onto what Qoheleth is saying. I don't think that we have to go too far with that. I'm okay just seeing one frame narrator. I think it's pretty clear that there is a separate voice than Qoheleth here, and again, you can go back to our first couple episodes in the series for more on why I say that. But I think once you try saying, maybe there's a second or even a third, it's just going too far with it. And a lot of this is just based on the fact that the book ends like a Baptist sermon, okay? There's like 5 different possible endings where you're going, all right, are you done yet? And in conclusion, and then he goes on for another 5 minutes, and now my last point is, and continues for another 5 minutes, and before we close, it's kind of that thing. So we have a conclusion here in verse 8. Like, this is a very neat, nice bow. And then verse 9 says, and moreover, so he's saying, and another thing. And then it happens again in verse 12, the exact same word, and another thing. So some people have tried to say that each one of those is a different voice. I think it's fair to just say that the remainder there is the frame narrator. Now, some commentators will try to say that he actually begins his speech in verse 8. So they would say Qoheleth has stopped speaking in verse 7. Now, once we get to the vanity of vanities, Hevel of Hevel, says Qoheleth, all is Hevel, that is the frame narrator. And the reason some commentators will say that is because Qoheleth doesn't really refer to himself in third person. So since it says Qoheleth, they think, well, that's probably someone else. That's possible. I see verse 8 as the end of Qoheleth's dialogue. I think the frame narrator picks up in verse 9. And the reason I say that is because verse 8 forms an inclusio with the very beginning of the book, where he said exactly the same thing. Hevel of Hevels, says Qoheleth, Hevel of Hevels, all is Hevel. I almost picture it like a theatrical play where no one has stepped down the stage yet, and you hear Qoheleth's voice from behind the curtain just announce out, Hevel of Hevels, says Qoheleth, all is Hevel. And then he steps out and gives you chapter 1 through chapter 12. And now, as he takes a bow and the lights darken, you hear him say one last time from the darkness, Hevel of Hevels, says Qoheleth, all is Hevel. So it's a nice, neat bow. It ties us back to the very beginning. In fact, this verse has 6 words in Hebrew, and 3 of them are Hevel. So literally half of the verse is the word Hevel. And there you have it, folks. We are at the end of Qoheleth's dialogue. We have made it all the way there. Now, we are not technically quite at the end of the book yet. We still have about 6 more verses to go. And that's where the frame narrator steps back in. I was originally going to include his comments in this episode, but the more I've thought about it, I want to actually set that apart and do that as its own episode, because that's the linchpin of where so many commentators and preachers go wrong, because they take what he says and they use it to negate and completely defang everything Qoheleth has said to this point. I realize we've had some heady stuff this week trying to figure out that whole extended metaphor of the broken down house. So I want us to come out fresh and ready to understand what's going on in that conclusion. So this week we wrapped up the words of Qoheleth. We got to the end of his speech and we addressed his extended metaphor of a decaying, dilapidated house as a way of talking not just about aging, but of the process of life itself, and how he continued to put death and decay in front of us, not to discourage us, but to show us that life is going to continue on beyond us. And that is in and of itself an encouraging thought, because it takes some of the pressure and stress that we tend to put on ourselves off of us. Because if life is no longer about us, we have the freedom to make mistakes. We have the freedom just to enjoy the little moments and not stress over all of the other things going on in the world. Now, we can take a break, and the world's still going to be there when we get back. And it is only by being reminded of how short a time we have here on this earth that we can actually enjoy it to its fullest. You must be aware of and periodically reminded of the darkness in order to fully appreciate the light. I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christianity that feared anything quote-unquote dark. I wasn't allowed to have bad guy action figures. Halloween and horror movies were forbidden. Even slightly creepy things like Edgar Allan Poe's works were looked upon with suspicion. But many good Christians enjoy the darker side of entertainment and life, because sometimes controlled exposure to the dark acts like a vaccine and gives you a better appreciation for the light. See, Qoheleth views darkness and death as very much a vaccine. You need a little bit of the disease itself in order to be immune to the effects of it. You need to die a little in order to live a lot. You need to take that death into you in order to live. And that's not just me here making up some wacky theology so I can enjoy watching horror movies and dressing up for Halloween. That is the very core of Christian belief. The hinge of our Christian faith is that there is no life without death, and that you cannot truly live until you have died. Until you have welcomed in a little bit of the darkness, you will never fully see the light. And so I can think of no more fitting way to end this episode than reading off some of the lyrics to David Draymond's The Light. An unforgivable tragedy. The answer isn't where you think you'd find it. Prepare yourself for the reckoning, for when your world seems to crumble again, don't be afraid. Don't turn away. You're the one who can redefine it. Don't let hope become a memory. Let the shadow permeate your mind. Reveal the thoughts that were tucked away so the door can be opened again. Within your darkest memories lies the answer if you dare to find it. Don't let hope become a memory. When you think all is forsaken, listen to me now. All is not forsaken. You need never feel broken again. Sometimes darkness can show you the light. Next week, we wrap up Chapter 12 and Ecclesiastes as a whole. Until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.